Hello YouTube. This is a video about the BBC, and it's a small compilation of research that I've done into the actions of the BBC, and through doing so I'm attempting to get to the bottom of whether the BBC is actually a fair and unbiased organisation as it claims to be, and whether it actually presents the news as it is, or it's actually attempting to manufacture news items, let's say. So I spent a little bit of time and I've done a little bit of research into what the BBC have been up to over recent years, and I'd like to just present a few items to you, and then when I've done so, I'd like to hear any comments you've got based upon what I've got to say. Right, well, first of all, we'll have a look at this chap here. Now, probably about 12 years ago, we used to have a chap on British television called David Bellamy, and he was a very popular man, a very cheerful chap. He used to present, he's a botanist, and he used to present programs which were associated with the natural world, let's say. And like I say, a nice guy. And probably, like I say, about 12 years ago he disappeared from our television screens, even though at the time he must have been one of the BBC's most popular presenters. And I suppose many did notice that he disappeared, but also quite a few didn't actually notice. Now, it turns out, having listened to David Bellamy's explanation of why he no longer works for the BBC, it's because, and I'll link to this video in the section below, he says that when the BBC began to push the man-made global warming agenda, and that they were attempting to help bring about the system of carbon credits, etc., and taxing the people upon the credit, the carbon that they were producing, and all this these carbon credits and such like, this taxation system was going to be run via the World Bank. It turns out that he was unwilling to go on the BBC and push the concept of man-made global warming because he considered it to be a lie, and that there was no truth at all in it. And because of that, he was willing to do as they said. Now, they basically said to him, either you do as we wish, or you'll be sacked. So, and he wasn't alone in this actually. There were actually 4 other people who were sacked at the same time by the BBC for their non-compliance in forwarding their agenda. Now, that's hardly something that you would associate with a group who were, as they say, fair and unbiased. They're only allowing one side of the story to be told, and they're deliberately going out of their way to silence anyone who says anything contrary to what they're trying to put across. So that's my first piece of evidence. I'll put a link to it below, as I say. Now, the next thing is the BBC and the cover-up that was in place for a long time, associated with well, it began with Jimmy Savile, didn't it? When it came out after not long after he died, that he'd been a child molester for many years, and when certain groups started to look into what had been going on with the BBC, it turns out that the BBC had been working to stop investigations being made into people who were there, who were BBC entertainers, let's say. They were presenters for the BBC, and it turns out since these investigations have been going on, that the BBC has in fact been covering up for the molestation of children for a long period of time now, and that child molestation at the BBC was actually, you could even say it was systemic, in that many other people who worked for the BBC at the time have now also been arrested for their behaviour when it comes to molesting children, many of whom were actually molested at the BBC's television centre in London, on their very premises. So that again doesn't hold well for the BBC, in that they actually work to cover these things up for a long period of time now. Okay, the next thing I'm going to cover is recently we had the Bilderberg meeting in the UK, in Watford, just north of London, and having watched what's been going on with the Bilderberg group for a long period of time now, well, probably for the last 5 years, and studied what they've been getting up to around the globe, and the fact that the mainstream media, including the BBC, has made no effort whatsoever to cover the actions of these people. It didn't surprise me when last weekend, when the Bilderberg meeting took place in as I say, in Watford, just north of London, it didn't come as a surprise when it turns out that the BBC actually dressed up a group of people in clothing associated with druids and such like, and took this car full of people up to the Bilderberg conference, and obviously the name of the game and what they were attempting to do was to humiliate the people who had real grievances at the Bilderberg meeting, the real protesters, these dressed up BBC people and the guys that accompanied them with the cameras. They were merely there to create a false story and to, as I say, humiliate and belittle the people who had turned up from around the globe in order to shed the light of attention on these people at the Bilderberg meeting. You know, the criminals who were actually meeting inside, the Grove Hotel. So again, that doesn't show that the BBC are in any way a fair and unbiased group when it comes to covering the news. I mean, to me, the only reason that they actually did send people up to the Bilderberg meeting was to belittle people, as I say, and had the alternative media not covered the Bilderberg meeting in the great depth that it did, I'm sure that the BBC wouldn't have set about attempting to manage the situation on behalf of the elites, let's say. So that's the third thing. So we've got the David Bellamy thing, we've got the Jimmy Savile thing, and we've got the Bilderberg, recent Bilderberg meeting, and the devious actions of the BBC there. And then finally, we've got the information relevant to what happened on the day of 9/11, when the BBC went live to America on the day of 9/11, as I say, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they began to report the collapse of a building called the Salomon Brothers building, which was Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex. It was the last building to be constructed. It was constructed in, I think, 1981, and the building collapsed actually did collapse at 20 past 5 in the afternoon, but the BBC mistakenly went live at 5 o'clock to the US, to their reporter with the New York skyline in the background, and they reported that the building had actually collapsed when, once you understand what the building looks like, the building is actually stood up still in the background behind the lady presenter. So where did the BBC get the information from? Who fed the BBC the information on the day? Because whoever it was clearly made a mistake, and they brought the building down at the wrong time. Whether they had told the BBC too soon, or whether the building was felled too late for some reason, I don't know. But the fact that the BBC went live to New York and attempted to cover a building's collapse when the building was actually still stood there in the background behind the presenter, I'm sure even the most accepting individual would accept that something is actually wrong in this instance, that something is amiss. So there again, that's my fourth piece of evidence there associated with the BBC, and I think it's a shame, really, because the ironic thing about the BBC is not only does it misinform and attempt to cover up for the actions of the powers that be, but the fact is, in the UK, the BBC are actually a state-funded enterprise, and by that I mean the people are actually forced into having to finance this operation, even though what it gets up to and what it's providing for us is nothing short of a disgrace. So I'd like you to just, as I say, have a look at what I've found. Should you wish to make a comment, obviously do so, and I'd be glad to hear what you have to say. Bye bye.